Okay, hey everyone. We're gonna instead of having you read sections 1 through 4, or you might still read them. I'm not sure. It depends how tomorrow goes. I figured I would do this video recording, books 3 through 4, and selections that I've picked through as a way to kind of help you understand books 1 through 4. Okay, so let's jump right in. So the question that he starts thinking about in book 3 is, what actions do we praise? Remember, he ends book 2 with the consideration that we praise virtuous actions, and this actually helps guide what is good because we praise what's good normally. So what actions do we praise? The virtuous actions. And then you can respond, right, but doesn't that entail that there's even more to it? It's not simply that we praise virtuous actions. We praise virtuous actions because they're chosen in the right way, right? He talks about the mean. And you might think this entails a certain view about action, namely that those were done voluntarily. So imagine that we start to consider a virtuous person's actions, but then we find out they're just being controlled by someone else and it's not actually theirs, right? So you might think that Aristotle's account requires a certain view of the actions coming from the person. If the person isn't doing it, then we wouldn't really praise them anymore for being virtuous. So Aristotle's view entails an account of free will, namely, like we think that the virtuous actions have to be praised in light of the person's choices, rationality, intentions. Okay, so this leads him into book 1, or I'm sorry, chapter 1 of book 3, and this is the opening paragraph. He says this: since excellence is concerned with passions and actions, virtue, and on voluntary passions and actions, praise and blame are bestowed, on those that are involuntary, forgiveness and sometimes also pity, to distinguish the voluntary and the involuntary is presumably necessary of those who are studying virtue or excellence, and useful also for legislators with a view to assigning both the honors and the punishments. So he's basically saying, since virtue is concerned with passions and actions, and on voluntary passions and actions, praise and blame are bestowed. So he's basically indicating only actions that are done voluntarily or as a result of the person's will are the ones that are praised or blamed. And those which are outside of their control, involuntary, we even give forgiveness and pity. Thus, to distinguish between voluntary and involuntary action seems to be required to understand what virtue is, right? Or what to praise and what to condemn. All right. So he also seems to indicate that it's important for legislators as well. So just take a moment here, pause it, think about, reread that quote. If you want to go to your book, that's literally the first paragraph. So you can chew on that. So let's jump to the next section. He says, those things then are thought involuntary, which take place under compulsion or owing to ignorance. So now he's trying to unpack what he said previously, which is we need an account of voluntary and involuntary action. So here he is starting. And that is compulsory, of which the moving principle is outside, being a principle in which nothing is contributed by the person who is acting or is feeling the passion. For example, if you were to be carried somewhere by the wind or by men who had him in their power. So he thinks involuntary action is wrapped up with this idea of being compelled to do something, right? It's outside of their action. That's what he means by the principle. Like the originating principle or feature of the action is due to external forces outside the person. So imagine if someone held a gun to your head, that's going to change the actions that you do. It's not because you want to do them, it's because you're being forced to do them. And Aristotle roughly thinks that would be compulsory and thus involuntary. But with regard to things that are done from fear of greater evils or for some noble object, for example, if a tyrant were to order one to do something evil, having one's parents or children in his power, and if one did the action, they were to be saved, but otherwise would be put to death, it may be debated whether such actions are involuntary or voluntary. Here's interesting, because now he's going to start making a distinction. If you notice the last paragraph, he talks about some being carried by the wind, like you're trying to get to Syracuse, but then the wind takes your ship off course, and that's outside of your control. Or even imagine that you promised someone that you'd be in Syracuse, and the winds take you off, and you actually can't fulfill that obligation. We would not blame you in that case because it's outside your control. Or let's say driving to work and traffic and this huge accident, or a better example, driving to work and someone hits my car, then I'm outside of, I deserve pity and forgiveness, not condemnation. But he does think, with someone holding a gun up to your head and saying, I'll kill your family if you don't go and rob this bank, it actually gets a little bit more complicated, because you could think you still have free will. You have the ability to deny or not to do what they said, even though it may cost you a great deal. So hence again, there's a debate there. Do you have genuine responsibility if you went and robbed the bank, right? Or imagine someone says, I'm going to kill your family if you don't kill those 20 people. We still might condemn you for going and killing those 20 people, because we would think, like, even though it sucks, that's still not right for you to do that. This brings up a really interesting idea in ethics, that sometimes people are just caught in these lose-lose situations. Anyways, you can think about that. Very interesting. But Aristotle just says, look, that's debatable, that at least we're getting this understanding of what involuntary action is and how that links with responsibility. Okay. All right. So something of the sort happens also with regard to throwing of goods overboard in a storm. For in the abstract, no one throws goods away voluntarily, but on condition of it securing the safety of himself and his crew, any sensible man does so. All right, you think about, like, if you were saving, you had a bunch of grain, right? And you're going back to your town, and everyone in the town required this grain to live, but there's this huge, massive storm, right? You're in this really tough pickle. Do you save the men that you have, right? Or do you start getting rid of the grain? Because when you get rid of the grain, it makes your ship lighter. And let's just say that helps you in navigating the storm better. And if you don't do that, your whole crew is going to die. So you'll have no grain. So what should you do? Once again, is that person, let's say they just toss everything overboard and they make it back home to port, your town will be understanding, but they'll also be upset. They'll say, why don't you risk it? So it's not, in those cases, it's tricky in regards to how we give praise or blame. We still might think that there's notions of responsibility there. We'll come back to these cases in a little bit. Okay. Such actions then are mixed, right? They're voluntary and involuntary. They're that conflict, but are more like voluntary actions, because you still have a lot of choice in it. You're not being completely forced. For they are worthy of choice at the time when they are done, and the end of an action is relative to the occasion. Both the terms then voluntary and involuntary must be used with reference to the moment of action. So voluntary and involuntary are going to come down to what's happening in the situation, how much of your control or how much of the action is still due to your own choice and passions and considerations, and how much of it is really forced by external considerations, right? If someone just takes control of my mind, then that would be a very extreme case of involuntary action. But in the case of the ship, where the winds are happening, and I would not do that, and normally I would just do what's right, it's mixed, it's complicated. Thus, we must appeal to the situation in regard to answering whether the actions were voluntary or involuntary, and that will thus affect our considerations of whether to praise or to blame them. Notice here, however, there's some interesting cases where the more difficult the situations, the more we might praise or blame them in regards to the actions that they take. So imagine in the ship case, again, that someone just says, we're not going to throw anything overboard because we need to get all of this to the city, and we're just going to go for it. And even if that means we die. If it ends up working out, they'll be praised for their courage, but they also might be blamed. That was a very risky endeavor, right? So we end up some very interesting cases. And if they die, then they'll definitely be condemned. They should have put stuff overboard, but we still might praise them for the attempt. So anyways, this is what Aristotle is saying. It's kind of complicated, especially as we start to consider whether it was virtuous or not. Because some might say that was foolhardy or brash, and actually they needed to they were going too far to an extreme. Some might say that's what courage took in that situation. Anyways, it's really fun to think about. That'd be a great declamation. But anyways, okay, let's keep moving. All right, so chapter 1 continued. Now the man acts voluntarily for the principle that moves. So now he's just talking about voluntary action. Now the man acts voluntarily for the principle that moves the instrumental parts of the body in such actions is in him, and the things of which the moving principle is in a man himself are in his power to do or not to do. So Aristotle, what makes voluntary action is that the principle, the origin of the action is inside the man. It's due to the man himself. Such actions, therefore, are voluntary, but in the abstract, perhaps involuntary. For no one would choose any such act in itself. So, he's once again, this is the same paragraph in regards to the ship, but he's just saying, like, the reason why we think it's voluntary, even in the ship case, is that the moving principle or the components are still the man's decision. It's a complex situation, but the man still is free to choose which route he's going to take, and how best to achieve those things. And it's going to involve deliberation. It's going to involve all these things. And Aristotle indicates that it most likely will still be involuntary action, even if it's a difficult situation. Okay, so to sum up this, Aristotle basically thinks voluntary actions require that the originating factor or factors, so to speak, have to be internal to the man's mind, or that he has to be the one who's able to make those decisions. And as those factors go more and more external to the person, the less and less blame we can offer, because the more and more involuntary the action becomes. Okay. This brings up a host of questions and issues, but I do think it's interesting at the very least, and you can begin to think about what actions are voluntary and involuntary using this model. So I encourage you to think about it before we jump to the next video.